So we are going to be exploring how you can navigate through these changing times and tides, how you can support people around you, and how you can also support yourself during times of uncertainty. So lots we're going to be covering. You will be given the slides after the session as well. Just to make sure that you can see the chat function, because I will be asking you some questions, asking for your input as we go through. If you could just give us a hello in the chat window, just so I can see if everyone can access that okay. So just say hello if you can see the chat window. I can't see any coming through just yet. So if you can't see the chat window, then instead if you can use the Q&A, and we'll see if that works okay. The chat is disabled, chat is disabled. Okay, I can see you saying that the chat is disabled, but I can see you in the Q&A. So this is good. I know that you can use the Q&A. Okay, so fantastic. We will press on. The first thing I'll do is introduce myself in case you don't know me or haven't been on a session with me before. So as you can see, my name is Sadie Restrick. I'm a very proud co-founder of a company called Wellity Global. So Wellity Global are an international training consultancy. Essentially, it's our job to create healthier and happier workplaces. We work across 80 countries. We have 450 training topics in our brochure. And essentially, these range from anything around leadership, mental health, neurodivergence, financial health, women's health, men's health, burnout prevention, digital addiction, you name it. We probably do have a specialist topic in that area, all provided as either e-learning, live workshops or virtual sessions. I myself have worked in this space for over 15 years now, essentially working as a trainer, a consultant, and also a published academic specialising in work-related stress. I've trained over 100,000 people, and essentially it is my job to help people enjoy their work, enjoy their working lives, and work with organisations to help create that kind of working culture so people do really benefit from their working environment and give everything they can, but also get back from their work as well. So today we're going to be talking all about change and how best to navigate as leaders through times of change. And it has become kind of a constant, and there's certainly something that isn't going to change anytime soon. We know some statistics here. So the first one from McKinsey, 87% of global organizations expect major disruptions within the next 5 years. A lot of that, yes, is related to restructures, but also things like the rise of AI and automation and change in tech, and also work location. A lot of people changing sort of their working models, people going back to the office mandates. And we've got over 75% of workers globally reporting these kind of changes. So a lot of people are feeling that pinch in a lot of workforces. And this one at the bottom, 59% of employees feel unprepared for the speed of change in their careers. So they don't necessarily feel that they've got the tools or the resources, the knowledge to navigate all of this change that they're seeing in their working life. And this does have an impact on mental health. We have nearly 1 in 3 people basically presenting with mental health challenges related to all this change and uncertainty. And we know when we look at the work-related stresses that are established by the HSE with their management standards, change is a really big one. And it's not necessarily whether change is happening, it's how well or how poorly it's actually being communicated. We have there the last stat that over 40% of adults globally have experienced increased anxiety as a direct result of the sheer pace of change in their lives. So there's a lot there to unpack and a lot there to think about, but it's particularly off the back of the last 5 years and having to navigate so much constant change. And some of you may have heard this kind of analogy that this is a marathon, not a sprint. We need to think about long-term sustainable practices to look after ourselves, to look after our colleagues and our teams, to look after our health. And this isn't something that's a short burst. It's something we need to think about more long-term strategies with. Now, that's very true, and I agree with that. But the kind of problems we have with that, particularly from a psychological perspective, is with both a marathon and a sprint, there's some form of finish line. And I kind of feel that a lot of us are actually more of in a maze right now, that we just think we're moving forwards and making progress, and we hit kind of a dead end or realize we're going back the way that we came, and we kind of have to re-navigate and sort of work out a new direction or a new route. And keeping moving forwards when we keep feeling like we're losing progress, we're not heading in the right direction, it's really demotivating. And when we constantly have to navigate that level of change for so long, kind of makes us feel that we're on unsteady footing and things just feel quite unstable. It makes us more prone to negative thinking. It makes us feel more stressed. And this really does have an impact, which is why it's so important that we ourselves as leaders are able to really discover the different ways that we can adapt in situations and role model those behaviors, but also help other people around us to adapt. And we know this is such a strong fundamental skill to have, and it is those individuals that can adapt to situations and adapt to change that are the ones that are going to survive and thrive into the future. And this is a really important modern day skill set. So we've got 80% of professionals there describe themselves as adaptable, reporting higher career satisfaction and better well-being. And then the bottom one, 70% of organisations say that resilient, adaptable workforce is a key to remaining competitive. So this really does matter, having this cognitive flexibility and enabling ourselves to be able to take a pause and a moment to make sure we're thinking through the next steps, thinking through what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the organization when we face change before immediately reacting? Means that we have an ability to respond in a more rational way and think in a more adaptive way. So having this cognitive flexibility is really, really, really important. And this is some of the things I'm going to be walking through with you today, how you can harness this yourself, but also how you can help your teams do the same thing. So I'm going to jump to a question in the Q&A, and we're going to, this is just before we go on to the bit, which is the brain bit, the neuroscience of like essentially why we find it difficult from a psychological perspective to deal with a lot of change. But I'm going to ask you a question firstly in relation to this relationship with our minds and our mental health and with change. Do you think change is something that can be good or bad for our psychological state, for our mental health? Is change good or bad for it? What do we think? You can use the Q&A with your response. So in case you missed that, is change good or bad for our mental health and our psychological state? Bad from Thanos. Okay. Good from James. Both. Okay. Got someone on the fence there. Interesting. Good from Andy. Okay. Anyone want to expand on their answer? Could be good or bad. Okay, from Maui, thank you very much. Ankit, you've got your hand raised. I don't know if people can come off mute. Sue, is that possible?
Don't think it is, no.
No, okay. Ankit, I can't come to you to come off mute. If you could use the Q&A. If you've got any questions or anything to ask, it's good. Oh, there we go, Ankit, good to hear from you. Depends on how it's managed, but on the whole, it's good if you know how to deal with it. Good, but it depends on the circumstances. I think we're programmed to non-change. Interesting one from you, Thanos. I'm coming back to that in a second. Can be either, it depends on a series of factors. Good, it keeps things progressing and supports development. Can be bad if it affects people's jobs and how managed. And if you want to get good at adapting, it is solving problems, overcoming challenge, therefore increasing cognitive ability. There's a good range of answers there, team. I really, really like a lot of those responses coming through, and we're going to expand on a lot of these. But yeah, fundamentally, it absolutely is good for us if we know how to manage it and if we have the right coping strategies. So if we deploy techniques that are good for our minds, that are good for our levels of resilience, then absolutely it can be good for us. We just have to manage it the right way. I really like Andy's emphasis there on problem solving and thinking logically how we can progress through what's happening, how it's making us feel, and what our choices are moving forward. So some really, really good points that have come through there. So absolutely, there was a point about how we're programmed and how we're programmed to not like change. And this is very much the case. But the key thing we need to remember here is a beautiful thing called neuroplasticity, that meaning even if we've always responded a certain way to certain trigger situations, such as change, if we've always found ourselves that we like familiarity and we like the norm, and the minute something changes, it kind of throws us off, we can still create new neural pathways. We can change the way that we respond to situations. It takes practice, but a lot of it comes down to how we perceive the situations that we're in, what we're telling ourselves and what message we're giving ourselves about a situation. So that's why working on, things like CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy, the message we're giving ourselves, this is disaster, this is exciting. I don't know if I can cope with this. I don't know what's going to happen here. Like if we change the message we're giving that this is really, really daunting, so this is really, really exciting, to change I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. We can give ourselves a different message about the change that's happening and use certain techniques so that the response and the relationship we have with the change situation changes accordingly. So we can, no matter where we're at, no matter where our teams are at in relation to how they're responding, the good news is, like I say, the brain is very, very good at adapting. but it can sometimes feel scary. It does elicit the stress response. So the amygdala, the little almond-shaped part of the brain, that's responsible for the stress response, that's responsible for alerting our threat system and flooding ourselves with the chemicals to basically deal with a threat situation, sometimes doesn't react in the most accurate and rational way to a change situations. It immediately sees it as threat, which means we drop about 15 IQ points. We very much operate in a very reactive state. And actually the focus on the prefrontal cortex, which can do a lot of the things that you're talking about in the chat in relation to problem solving and thinking clearly and thinking about coping strategies, is not deployed, because at that moment we just want to protect ourselves. Now, when that keeps getting activated, it starts to become a constant chronic state where we find it really difficult to think logically and rationally, because we're operating under what's basically a blinkered state. We're just focusing on the now. I need to get through this. I need to deal with this. Now I need to deal with this. We constantly feel like we're firefighting, and it doesn't necessarily give us the ability to step back and think, okay, no, but what is actually happening here? What are the positives of this change situation? Is there a different way of looking at this situation? What advice and support can I get to help me through this situation? So it's about creating opportunities for us to relax so that we can respond. We have to deactivate that stress state that doesn't feel that the world's going to all against us, and think, okay, what actual options do we have now? But yes, it can feel scary and that we're under threat, absolutely, because basically the brain is trying to protect us from harm. It's often the case, when your kind of mind is wandering and you're off and you're kind of daydreaming and thinking, that's basically when you're operating out of something called the default mode network. And this is often when we start to ruminate and overthink about change situation, what it means, what could happen, catastrophizing, fear casting, which is forecasting with fear, and thinking the worst. And this can really put us in quite a negative spiral, a negative loop, almost like a record is playing and it's stuck on a groove and playing the same song. And we keep thinking the same negative habitual thoughts, which means it can be hard to break that loop and start thinking of a more optimistic message. And like I say, that therefore affects the perception of the change situation and what's happening and what it means for us. And this makes it really, really difficult for us to have that level of optimism and hope and assurance in a situation. And we can get stuck in a bit of what I call mental tug of war, like an internal conflict of, I know this is good. I know this is good for me. I know this is good for the organization. I know there's a reason for this being done, but I just feel really uncomfortable with this. So we kind of start to give ourselves a hard time of, why aren't we adjusting? Why aren't we adapting? This is good change. But it's because it's something that we fear. It's because it's something that we don't know, and we are losing what feels good. Our brains love familiarity and love routine. They love to be in the comfort zone. 98% of people stick in the comfort zone because it is just that. It's comfortable. And we get that sense of reward when we have these fluid routines that we move through and we know what's going to happen. And the minute we're pushed out of that, it elicits that again, that stress response of, whoa, what's happening? What's going to happen here? What's going to happen to me? Can I cope with this? And so we're having this situation where things that we like, that stability, the security, anyone who's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, the stability of knowing what's going to happen is taken from us. And that naturally activates that alarm system. So the long-term impact, going back to the question that I started with, yeah, it can be good or bad. It depends what coping strategies we deploy, because if we use the right healthy ones, problem-focused, emotion-focused, really positive, practical ones to learn, then it's going to increase our level of resilience. It's going to increase our cognitive flexibility. It's going to prove to us, however big or significant the change that we got through it, we can do it. And it gives us tools and resources to keep leaning on as we move forwards in life. It's kind of like having a toolkit of different strategies and techniques. And every time you go through something tough or difficult or a change situation, you either use the tools you've got, or you might discover that I don't have a tool for this, so I need a new one. So you keep on growing and being open and curious to new ways of adjusting and adapting and dealing with situations. So yes, it can have a good impact, but if we don't deal with it in a healthy way, again, as a lot of you said, it can be really negative. It can be really, really damaging, because chronic stress is going to play havoc with our mental state, but also our physical state. And it's really about making sure we're being proactive in deploying the right strategies to make sure the impact is a good one, not a bad one. So the impact of constant being in situations, I've heard the phrase change fatigue so many times over the last 6 months, of there just being so much change happening, and people's capacity to cope with that is really starting to wane. It's quite interesting. There's a study done by Ghana, Gartner, and it said that employers' ability to cope with change is 50% less than it was pre-pandemic. And what's quite interesting is when we look and compare the difference between day-to-day changes that we ourselves as leaders might think are quite minor and quite trivial, actually have 2.5 times the impact on change load, on the impact on our capacity than large organizations, like major transformations, because it's that cumulative effect. It's the little things that we don't necessarily feel that we need to check in with people, because we think, oh, that's quite a small thing, or that's quite a small thing, that's also quite a small thing. When there's a huge, big organizational announcement, we tend to be a bit better at understanding that we need to communicate. This could have an impact, particularly if it's changing people's job stability. But it's the little things that chip away, because we all kind of diminish and think, well, that's not that significant. That doesn't really change things that much, and that doesn't really have a direct impact on my team. But it's still constant change that we're having to navigate and think about. And that pulls on our cognitive load, because we're constantly having to adapt and think, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my job? What does this mean for my team? That's draining. That's draining in itself. So next question to you. I'm looking at my Q&A window over here. When we're thinking about change, just a yes or a no firstly, have you seen a change curve before? Have you seen the change curve that we move through? Just while I'm waiting for responses to that, I can see some really good points that you came through about why it's good for us, why change is good for us, about resilience, breaking routine, adaptability, growth, self-esteem. And any growth comes with stretching ourselves. If you want to get better at anything, you have to go through that point of discomfort. It's really, really important point. Okay, yes from Rapinda, a couple of no's. Okay, yes, we need it. Yes, Kubler-Ross, excellent from Steve. Yeah, there's lots of different variations, and I just wanted to get a bit of a high-level overview from the room about who's come across these curves or not. But they're quite interesting, because it basically walks through the different emotions that we move through during times of change. And what I want to emphasize firstly with this is it's not linear. It's not a case that every single person will move through these different phases, will zigzag, we might jump phases. It's not something that every single person will experience every single phase or emotion. Some people, if they've experienced this kind of change before, might literally leapfrog to the end and feel able to adapt to the situation. Other people might keep going back and forth at the beginning. Yeah, absolutely, James. You beat me to it. It's similar to the grieving stages. So Kubler-Ross basically looked at the processes that we move through when we're going through grief, and ascertain these different emotional states. And then a lot of authors and a lot of psychologists have gone on to expand on this and establish that any form of change is associated with that grieving process, because we're grieving what we once knew. Remember that point around we're losing what feels good, we're losing what we know and what feels familiar. So any change really can elicit that sense of grief, because we're moving forwards, and something that we used to know, the way that we worked, the way that we interacted, the way that we communicated might be gone forever. So it does elicit a similar grief response. So it's a really important point from James there. But what's key with this when we're talking about leadership support and how best to lean in and support your people and have conversations with your people is understanding you could have a collective team and every single one of them could be at different points. And this means not only have you got to adapt your approach and how you communicate to make sure you're taking this on board and taking into account in the way that you present and that you interact, particularly in one-to-ones, but we've also got to be quite mindful and quite cognizant of the fact that our whole teams, they're in really different places around how they feel about this change. That could naturally create quite quickly kind of voids between them and tensions between them, because some are like, yeah, this is great, and others like, no, it's not, this is awful, why is this happening? And so straight away then you're adding another stressor into the mix and another risk in the mix, because you've got interpersonal conflict and tension, morale's going down, and rather than leaning on each other, because they're all at different places and how they're feeling about this change, they could actually be going in the opposite direction. So something like this, I think, is a really good tool. I've used it in team discussions, in team meetings, and saying, it's very normal to feel at different points here, and encouraging basically to people to feel validated in what they're going through, but also show more compassion to each other. If they are thinking that perhaps someone is a bit more quiet or withdrawn than usual, a bit more snappy and intolerant, perhaps a bit more quiet, and rather than defaulting to that person seems rude today, thinking, yeah, perhaps that they're at this point on the change curve, perhaps they're experiencing this at this moment in time. So we just kind of normalize these different emotions. It's not necessarily about sticking labels on people. It's just thinking, yeah, that's normal, and I feel validated. Even if I experience all of these emotions on this curve at once, it's normal. So I'm going to give you a broad level example based on the experiences that I've had with clients the most recently, which is increasing use of things like AI and tech in day-to-day processes and the impact that this can have. So I'm going to walk you through the change curve using that as a worked example, so you can start to explore how this potentially works. I'm going to jump before I do, though, to a question from Andy. Do you find industry differences with change? For example, construction deal with change daily, manufacturing more stable? Yeah, really, really good point. Yes, I absolutely do, because it's something that the bottom line is familiarity eliminates fear. And if we are in an industry that constantly has to navigate change, and construction's a good example because, you know, particularly in roles like site management, you know, we have to constantly navigate suppliers not arriving, contractors not doing what they, you know, hitting a certain deadline, timescales shifting, timeframes shifting, client briefs changing. So it kind of becomes the norm. So it's something that we don't necessarily fear. So we basically start to build that cognitive flexibility and remain quite calm in the face of significant change. You've also got to look at different types of industry and different types of working cultures where you compare kind of, is it an innovative, constantly taking risk, growing industry, or is it one that's more tradition and legacy based? So the ones that are kind of had this culture of this is just the way that we do things around here, and this is how we do things, and we don't change things, we don't change the status quo. You know, they're going to have these set processes that could have been in place for a very long time. And the minute you change anything, it could actually create very quickly a domino effect because we're just not used to it. So it's a really, really important point when we're looking at how people navigate change is what they're used to in their organization, in their industry, and whether it's something that is typically considered quite fast-paced and innovative, and that's just how they work. Compared to if they're sort of more legacy based in their sort of processes and in their systems. So change curve, this one particularly is adapted by someone called Fisher. But the first one, particularly when we hear any kind of change announcement, and with this one with the introduction of AI, a lot of people are defaulting to, is my job going to be safe? Does that mean that there's a lack of stability, lack of security? What does that mean for my future? How will I pay my mortgage? So it's that instinctive, that stress reactive response to, am I in danger? So as I said, some people might bypass some of these, some people might stay stuck at them for quite a while, but it's just about validating that all of this is normal and how to help people move forwards towards the far right, which all comes down to communication. Next one, see a slight peak in happiness. So this is basically, say, the introduction of AI as an example. Great, okay, I'm going to learn to do new things, and I can do this. Yeah, I can do this. Yeah, absolutely, I can learn this new system. This is great. And that slight peak of happiness, then we often see that followed up by fear. But what if I'm no good at it? What if I can't cope with it? What if I can't learn it? What if everyone's better than me? Comparisonitis, and starting to doubt ourselves and doubting our ability to learn this. And we start to move more to a fixed mindset than a growth mindset. Now, we can then move in a different direction towards denial. This is quite a hard one when people are stuck in this frame of mind of just kind of basically sticking their head in the sand. Basically a situation where it's like, no, this won't happen. They'll realize it's a terrible idea and they'll get rid of this system. We'll go back to the way that things were. So basically clinging on to that tradition and that legacy and the way that we've always done things. Why would you change something when it's always worked absolutely fine? And that resistance and that pushback. So at this point, you might see quite a lot of disengagement, and just, you know, you invite someone to come and attend a training to learn this new system. They're like, no, I'm fine. Or they keep sort of procrastinating and delaying and putting it off because they're pushing back and they're denying this change is actually going to happen or actually going to stick. Moving down to threat. So this is an even stronger sense of fear. Why can't things just stay the same? I don't understand why this is happening. So you might see elevated levels of frustrations and tensions, either displayed outwardly or people giving themselves a real hard time. But it's just that level of anger and frustration. And then more turning inwardly is guilt. He's starting to use the word should. It's a very dangerous little word, should. I should be able to cope with this. Everyone else seems fine with this. What's wrong with me? And starting to really give themselves quite a hard time. And we can see productivity, engagement, all starting to drop as we move through this dip in the curve. Could progress more up into disillusionment. Work will never be the same. And just this point of staying more in the frozen point of the fight, flight, or freeze, just stuck of just, there's no point, never going to be the same. Or moving on to actual mild depression, if they're feeling really, really low about the loss and grieving what was, just feeling that it's hopeless, feeling there's no point, that they can't process this new working world, all these changes that are going on. The energy is really low, apathy is quite high, and just struggling, just really, really struggling. And all of this is absolutely normal. And in some cases, it might send them all the way down to hostility. Do you know what? I've had enough. I can't do this. Too much change. I really don't want to be part of this. And it's why we've seen a lot of organisation turnover increasing, because people don't want to deal with this level of change. And they'd rather take on a new challenge rather than navigate all the change that's going on in their organisation. But what we want to do is move them up towards gradual acceptance. So kind of firstly dipping their toe into like, okay, so this AI thing, can you tell me more about how that's going to work and how it affect my role, and starting to tentatively ask those questions and see themselves in this future. And they might ask those questions, the answers might absolutely terrify them, they might feel completely intimidated and completely out of their comfort zone, and then go all the way back to fear and threat. But what we want to do is give the reassurance and the knowledge and the information to get them moving towards a commitment to think, do you know what, this sounds like a really, really good new system. I think it's really going to improve efficiencies, and it's going to really, really help us make a difference to how we operate, to how we work, to how we service our clients, and really get on board with that. And when people are there, they're great advocates for that change as well, moving forwards with other people. So it's a really good model to just acknowledge where people might be at and think about the different level of information that they might need and different level of support they might need, because as I say, it all comes down to communication. That's why the majority of change initiatives fail, because there is not enough communication. People think, oh, we've said that, why do we need to say it again? We've already informed them of this. But it has to be that constant flow of information, the constant updates. If a company know a change is coming, but they don't necessarily know a lot of the detail, saying we can't share this with you yet, we don't have the answers for this yet, but just having that open, transparent communication, inviting questions is so, so important. So I'm going to move on to more sort of what we can do around this and around practical techniques. But before I do, I'm going to ask in the Q&A for your current top tips of how you help people move through change. So what you currently do, or things that you found have worked in your career to date. And before I go on to tell you what I think, I'd love to hear from all of you of how you currently help support, how perhaps you've been supported throughout your career during times of change. So tell me what you think works or what you've tried yourself before. So in case you missed that in the Q&A, before we move on to the strategies to help people navigate through change, tell us what you currently do or have done or have had people do with you. Jade, people being transparent really helps, and honest and open with feedback. Do you know what? It's the biggest way to build trust is open, honest feedback, and just saying, I really don't know. You know, I can understand, I completely appreciate that it might make you feel apprehensive, and please come to me if you've got any questions and I can support you in any way. But just being so open, it really does matter. We've got constant regular communication, take colleagues on the journey. I love that phrasing, communicate and involve people. Absolutely. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, James, about how like regularly we engage people and make them feel part of the process and create often what I call predictability anchors. And you know, yes, there's a lot we might not know, but what do we know and what can we stick to? What could we ask for people's involvement on so they feel they've got a sense of autonomy and influence over what's happening? Because what this does is it shifts us to something's happening to me to being something that I'm part of. And that completely changes our relationship with the change experience. So I really, really like that phrasing there, James. Excellent point. We're amid huge transformational change, and the comms have been pitched at management only. A big part of what we've been doing besides training is taking time to help them understand where they fit, what that means, and it takes time to answer concerns and fears. I'm going on to some questions shortly about that, Steve, so it's a brilliant point. Incremental small steps, storytell success via role models who demonstrate the benefit of change. Love the emphasis on storytelling and making them know what, like making sure they know what the vision is. Why are we doing this? Excite them so that they actually feel that they're leaning into this and think, wow, this is going to be a really big transitional 6 months, but this is why, this is where we're heading, and this is why it's going to be so great. So they feel more motivated to lean into that level of discomfort and see it as excitement. Celebrate the small wins, absolutely one I'll come back to shortly, James. Just making sure we're going to maintain that momentum by making sure people know that their little goals matter. And it's one of the most powerful motivators is that power of small wins, of knowing that we're making progress, of knowing that we're moving forwards and having those micro goals rather than just the big vision in 2 years' time, the organization is going to be this. You know, okay, but let's just reverse engineer that back and think, okay, how can we focus each day, each week, each month and making sure we're maintaining the optimism and looking at the small wins as we move through. Clear sight of end goal, absolutely, Thanos. At workplace, it's difficult, especially for old team, but it's possibly only required systematic with discipline. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to have people of different generational profiles, different needs during times of change, and it's making sure we adapt that accordingly. So first thing I want to talk about is making sure that you yourself are taking care of yourself, because it's very, very difficult for us to lead and be resilient and be role models and do all the things that you're talking about in the chat if you're not taking care of yourself. So if there is a change announcement or something happens or something shifts and it's either told to you directly and you have to cascade that to your team and translate it to your team, or perhaps it's a company-wide announcement and you're thinking, oh, this is going to cause a lot of apprehension, uncertainty. We call this the traffic light system. So ready to stop and take a moment and think, okay, how do I feel about this? What emotions am I experiencing? Do I feel apprehensive and anxious? What am I processing? What are my immediate thoughts about this situation? And just making sure we're taking stock of that. This is a really good, in any high pressure, high pinch moment, I do this all of the time, just stop and okay, so we're not operating out of that reactive state, but we're taking our side, even if it's just a 1 minute pause, to just make sure that we're taking a breath and we're operating from that prefrontal cortex and we're being logical and rational rather than reactive in a situation. There's a reason we tell kids to count to 10 if they're feeling angry, because it's a really good way just to sort of regulate our system. Then the amber is getting ready to prepare. Okay, so what questions might I get asked? What emotions might I see in the team, thinking about how well we know certain team members and how they might react in different situations, thinking what's the best way for me to communicate this? Should it be a team announcement? Should it be an email? Should it be one-to-ones? And then we can proceed. But so often we hit the accelerator and think, right, this is happening, off we go. And we don't take stock and just stop and think, okay, what's the best route forward here? We just react. So it's really, really important for us to do that. And then we can apply the SICK method. So first thing is the S, which, okay, what is happening and why now? So making sure we know the what, but also the why. So the point that Thanos made about the end goal, also the vision, why is this change essentially happening? So we can frame it as something that we can answer questions to. So it's not just this is happening, this office is closing, this system's being introduced, but why that's being done, the thought process behind that decision. Again, it comes down to one of the first points around transparent communication. So what's happening? Why now? Then the I, the impact. So just acknowledging the impact this might have on people, being really, really transparent and honest. The impact, yes, on them psychologically, but also on things like their workload capacity, and thinking about, yes, the organization, but also thinking about colleagues, but also for immediate team members. And then the call to action. So what do we need to do? What do I need to do based on this? Is there immediate action? Is there decisions we need to talk about as a team? Are there changes we need to make as a team? But just making sure we're going through this framework of thinking what and why is happening, what potential impact could it have, and now what do we need to do next in the face of this? It might just be that we need to schedule more regular one-to-ones to check in with people and how they're feeling. It might be as a team we need to collectively look at how we can be more efficient in how we work a certain process, but making sure we're thinking along the way, and definitely in keeping with a few points made in the Q&A, that we're involving people and thinking, okay, how can I ask questions? How can I invite opinion and insight from the team to make sure that they feel part of at least a very minor amount of decisions being made? So some techniques to think about, really important to create a space. So today I want to talk about X. So this change that's been announced, this announcement that you might have seen. So the goal is to make sure we're just all aligned. We know what's happening. We know what it means for us. We know how we're going to move forward. And then inviting that sense of interaction. So before we jump in, is anything on someone's mind that they want to talk about? Has anyone heard any pieces of this update elsewhere? Making sure we're being really keen to find out if there's gossip already circulating. Reinforce those key messages. Again, the what, the why, the impact, the call to action. But just being really open to asking people what they might have already heard or seen, what concerns they might have, and really working hard to create that sense of psychological safety so people can go, do you know what, I heard this and I'm a bit concerned. Do you mind telling me if you know anything about that? And just making sure that people know there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's no such thing as, an emotion that's not allowed in that room. Just being really, really clear and assuring of them that this is a time to talk about what's happening. And then using sort of clarifying questions to check understanding. So asking if you have a town halls, if it's an email announcement, if it's something that was in the press, what questions do you have? What are you taking away from this? This one I quite like. How does that news feel for you? How are you responding to it? What are your immediate thoughts and emotions? How does this change, what you're focused on? What support or clarity do you need help going forward with? These are all really good, open, empowering questions. One of my absolute favorites that's not on here is how do you think we could make this feel more manageable? Because it's going to feel too much for a lot of people. It's going to feel that it's overwhelming. So how can we make this feel more manageable is a really, really good one. If people say, oh no, I'm just exhausted, I'm just overwhelmed, I'm just stressed, I'm just and use quite specific words, do you mind telling me more about that? So do you mind is I respect your privacy, and you might not want to, but telling me more about that is I want to know what that means for you. It's a really compassionate question because I know how I think and feel if I'm stressed or overwhelmed or worried or uncertain, all these words, but I don't know how somebody else might feel if they use that word. So saying, do you mind telling me more about that is a great one. How long they felt like that, who they've spoken to about it, what support they have, but it's a really good open question. And then at the end, start to think, okay, right, the three most important things we need to remember are, they're your predictability anchors. What do we know here and what we're going to hold on to? As I said, even if we're going to have regular one-to-ones, I'm going to have an open slot every Monday, 12 till 2 for drop-ins. If anyone thinks of any questions they want to come along, my door is literally open. But talking about how this connects to priorities, connects to perhaps previous meetings and previous discussions. So remember that change curve and that you might have different people in different emotional states, and that's fine. We need to validate that. Making sure we're still focusing on team priorities and tasks and inviting questions around that side of things, but emphasize AAAs, this accessibility, availability, and accountability for you as a leader. So making sure we're always thinking, am I accessible? Can they actually get to me? Am I somebody who's taking accountability for my actions? And am I making myself available so that people do know they can come to me if they do have any concerns, and that they know that's a safe space where I'm going to feel validated and assured as opposed to judged? So really, really important when it comes down to communication, which is what a lot of you said is important for moving through that change curve. Some really good techniques for you to use and deploy. So the other thing I'm going to talk about is trust. And I said about psychological safety. Psychological safety is kind of like a team concept, but trust is always between two individuals. And we know that when there's trust in a leader, it creates a very stable foundation for employees and their organizations to feel that they can flex and they can adapt and they can also trust, because they've got that hope in that person that's leading the charge forward. It's kind of like having a crew and you're the captain of the ship. They're going to look to that captain and think, you know what, I know you know where we're headed. I know you're going to change course if there's danger, if the weather's changing. And just we've got that faith that that person is going to get us through those changing and challenging tides. So it's all about that level of trust in the person that's at the wheel. But when an employee experiences low trust in their leader, their capacity for change is cut in half because they haven't got that hope and that assurance that I know where we're going and that I want to follow you, because they don't trust that person. So a really important one to remember throughout this process is we go before ego. It's all about we as a collective, how we can stay together. If there's any early signs of kind of mutiny on the ship, we're taking those early proactive steps to nip that in the bud. But I love this point at the bottom, this definition of being uncompromised by doubt. So we have a team that know no matter what, that leader is going to have their back, their colleagues have got their back, and they're in this together, however challenging and tough it will be, that they know that they're going to be supported throughout that process. And that support is really, really important. So the last model I'm going to walk you through is, I'm a big fan of this, Will, and it's something that really helps us start to think about our key competencies and what we're naturally strong at, but also perhaps where we need some work. So this was established by the Centre of Creative Leadership and essentially looked at the key competencies that any leader needs to have trust from their people. And naturally, we find that individuals lean towards being stronger on the structural side, which is the business focus, or the people side. So if you're somebody that's naturally an empath, perhaps quite emotionally intelligent, you might lean towards the people side, so that the people impact and the more soft skills, as you might call them, element of, this is going to be really tough for people. I need to make sure I'm there for them. But the structural side is that, but there's a business reason for doing this. We need to drive this forwards. We need to maintain standards and performance and productivity throughout this change. So as much as, yes, we want to support people, we've still got jobs to do. So that's more the structural business side. So it depends on lots of different factors, your experiences, your personality. For example, if you're familiar with DISC profiling, if you're a D or a C, you're probably more structural side. If you're an I or an S, you're probably more people side. But it's something that we need to, as leaders, get the balance right. So it's kind of like thinking, which bit am I naturally good at and which bit do I perhaps need to work on, because we need to have a sense of balance. I just want to check, there's a question from Anki. Yes, you're right, but sometimes seniors not understand, feel like something wrong will happen and it could be a safety or regulatory requirement. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes there is something a greater risk during times of change and people don't necessarily listen to us when we voice those concerns. But I think that's why having that psychological safety is so important. So people do feel heard and valued and acknowledged for their contributions and their suggestions. It's so important that people do have that capacity to speak openly and know that they're not going to be judged, and that if even someone says something and you think that's quite peculiar or it's a perspective that you've never had, it's having that curiosity of thinking, I'd never think of that. That's really interesting. Can you tell me how you reached that conclusion? And just be really open to thinking, wow, that's so different to how I looked at this, but being really curious as to why that's so different to how you perceive it, as opposed to judgmental. The more we can do that in any capacity, it really empowers us, but it empowers people around us. So I'm going to walk you through some of these, well, all of these points on the wheel, and just some tips on how you can increase your people side or your structural side, depending which you think needs a little bit more flexing. But it's like any muscle, that the more we do it, the more we work it, the stronger it becomes. But if you look, they're kind of exactly opposite each other, but we need to sort of bring ourselves into the middle of the circle. So for example, realistic patience is opposite sense of urgency. So yes, we need to be patient with people. They're perhaps not going to be performing at their optimal level, but we do need to have a sense of urgency around the priorities that need to get done. So that's an example of how they're opposites, but we need a balance with them. So first one is increasing your people competence. So the coping with the transition goes back to the points I was making with the traffic light system, is making sure that you're coping with the transition. So practicing your self-awareness and thinking about how aware you are of your own thoughts, your own emotions, how perhaps you are actually considered to be as a leader. There's someone called Tasha Eurich who has done a lot of work and a lot of studying around the concept of self-awareness. And she states that only, but based on her research, only about 15% of the population are truly self-aware. She calls them unicorns. Because self-aware people, they don't just take time to sort of be introspective and stop and think, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? And have that reflection time, but they're also really good and again, really open and curious about how other people perceive them. And that's a powerhouse when we do that. So asking people, what could I do better as your leader right now? How could I better manage this situation? If you were in my role during this change, what would you do differently? And really sitting with and listening to that feedback. So practicing that self-awareness, but being really patient and compassionate with yourself. If you're having a hard time processing what's happening, perhaps you're in that sense of conflict, that perhaps you're not completely on board with what's happening, but you've got to role model this is a really good positive change. That's a real internal conflict. So have people that you go to support and just to offload to, so you can remain that resilient, optimistic, hopeful, visionary leader with your people, but you're not trying to bottle up and suppress what you're actually feeling during that process. So using healthy coping strategies, having outlets and an ability to express yourself, because otherwise we kind of feel that we're always walking around with a mask and we're trying to portray this facade of everything's great and fine, and deep down we're like, I'm so tired. So just making sure that we're taking care of ourselves so we can show up and be our best as a leader. The realistic patience is pacing the change. Yes, there might be a drop in certain areas, particularly when it comes to focus. So really narrowing down on what are the actual priorities. And it's interesting how often we use the word priorities, but when it comes down to fundamentally what that means, it means the most important things. So it's very difficult to have more than one of those. So thinking, okay, what do we really need to focus on as a team? What is the absolute priority? And what can have a little bit of flex and give to it? What can we apply the good enough is good enough to? And just thinking about how much information we're giving people, if we're being overwhelming with how much we're telling them, and just thinking, okay, let's just stagger this a little bit so people don't feel that this is all too much that's happening. empathy, 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 active listening, hearing what people aren't necessarily saying as well as what they are saying, tuning into body language, nonverbal cues, regular check-ins more so than usual, recognizing different shifts in people's emotional state and little red flag indicators of thinking, yeah, that's quite unusual for that person, and tailoring your approach for that person, for where you think they're on the curve, what else you think they might have going on in their life. Really, really important to making sure we're channeling in with them. But part of that being empathic, please remember that none of us are perfect. We all sometimes say things and think that probably wasn't the best thing to say there. But we can own it, we can be accountable for it. But always remember that it's not necessarily always the words that we use, it's how we make people feel. That's what in 5, 10, 15 years to come, they're going to look back and think, God, that was a huge organizational change. And do you know what I remember that manager, and they made me feel so supported and so validated and so heard, and they really looked out for me. That's not something you create with words. That's something you create with your body language, with your verbal cues, with transparency, with creating trust, by talking about, previous situations that you've been through, by being vulnerable. That's how we create that sense of connection. We show empathy. Being transparent, we talked about telling people what we can, what we do know, even if we are limited of what we can share. Admitting our own mistakes, we all make them, and the more that we share them and validate them, the more that other people know it's okay to fail as well, and to own it and to lean into it. All that will create that sense of psychological safety. Be really proactive with feedback. If people do ask questions, go back to them as promptly as you can, even if it's to say, I still don't have an answer to your question, but please do leave it with me and I'll do my best to find an answer out via XYZ. But just be really, really proactive with doing that, so people don't feel that they're throwing a question into a chasm and it's not being responded or listened to. One of the best ways to get trust is to show trust. So showing that appreciation for people, delegating to people, encouraging a sense of responsibility. If people are really stepping up and into the change and kind of like being your change advocates, use them, lean on them, say to them, I could really do with your help in communicating this more, to make sure that you've got good support around you to spread this message. And helping people promote a sense of collaboration and checking in with each other and supporting each other. I love using the question, what's your number? We're talking about capacities around coping, around workloads, around pressure, and regularly in team meetings, we just go around and say, what's your capacity? And give a number out of 100. And we all know if somebody says 90, 95, one, don't bother them because they are very, very, very busy and they don't have capacity. But two, if they're regularly given that answer, that is not sustainable. So I know to have a conversation with them about what's pushing them to that level. But it also means if some people say, yeah, probably about 60, 65, they've got a bit more bandwidth essentially to step in and help others. So it's just a really easy question to find out where people are at with the pressure that they're under without going into talking about more provocative or emotive words like stress and mental health, because that can naturally feel quite difficult for people to talk about. And going against the grain, encouraging growth, embracing learning opportunities, encouraging people to take risks, to try things and say you might not get that right, and that's okay. We're all learning as we go, particularly if it is a new system or something, and pushing your own comfort zone, trying new things and thinking, okay, this might not work out, but let's give it a go, and then evaluate what went wrong, what went well, and what it's taught us. The next one is the structural competence. So being a catalyst for the change is kind of being that voice and that advocate for what is happening and why it's happening, elevating that vision, reinforcing that vision, and kind of being like, I know I talked about being the captain on the ship and in the sea, but now you're going to be the lighthouse. So the lighthouse is that beacon in the light of like, we're in the dark and it's stormy and there's all this happening, but we're heading towards that light. So if we have that bright and reinforced and we see it in all that we do, we're going to keep heading towards it. So you're going to be the captain of the ship, but also the lighthouse. Small milestones, celebrating the small wins, keeping moving forwards towards that lighthouse, and engaging others as much as possible in helping you towards that vision. The sense of urgency is going to be helped by quick wins. If there are things that we can tick off and get a dopamine fix and think, yeah, we did that really well as a team, all helps morale, motivation. Model urgency around key priorities, not around everything. Make sure we actually drill down on what does really need immediate attention right now, and holding ourselves accountable for that as well in what we're doing in relation to our daily tasks. Optimism. this can sometimes feel a bit hard, and we don't want to move to the territory of toxic positivity and kind of like, yeah, it's all fine, it's all going to be great, but it's that sense of hope. It doesn't negate that this is tough and difficult, but it's saying, you know, this is why it's happening, this is why it's going to be really positive, and using really resilient language is really, really important. Sharing success stories was definitely shared earlier in the chat. But talking about how this has been done well, talking about other organisations who've perhaps been through similar changes. We've got tons of case studies like that if you ever need any, around organisations who've gone through a certain change phase and come out the other side, and these were the benefits to the team and the organisation, the workforce. So it's really good to share those kind of stories. Being tough, not easy if you're somebody who's more on the people focused, but being assertive, practicing those skills where you can, setting really, really clear directives and expectations of people that we do still need to show up and do our jobs, even if things are feeling tough, which is why we need to narrow down on what the actual priorities are so people feel that they're manageable. Being really confident in making decisions and backing yourself in doing that kind of links back to the bottom one and capitalizing on strengths, but really backing yourself and think, no, I've got this. I can lead my team through this. And even thinking about the position of your body language, if we stand up, sit back with their shoulders up, think, no, I've got this. I can do this. I can have hard conversations. I can lead through this change. It can actually create a shift of over 50% in our psychological state and our positivity within ourselves, just our body language and our posture. But just telling ourselves that and reinforcing that. If you do sometimes back yourself, doubt yourself, then reinforcing that message that you've got this and you can do this and you can do hard things, because it is hard. It is hard sometimes. So building confidence in your abilities, reminding yourself of all the things that you have achieved and all the tough times that you've led through before. Knowing when to step into situations, but also when to delegate. Often people who particularly if you're a D profile, if you're a DISC, but often it can be hard to relinquish control and delegate things out. But 90% of people want to help when asked. So think about people that you potentially could delegate to help them feel empowered and they're learning new things as they go through the change. And then capitalize on strengths. Any kind of strengths-based approach is always going to be good for resilience and empowerment. But promote a growth mindset, promote this fact of, one of my favorite words is the word yet. Someone says, I just can't cope with this. No, you haven't found a way to cope with it yet. I have not got the skills to pick up this new system. No, you haven't got the skills yet. Yet says you can, you will, just not there yet. So it's a powerful little word to introduce to people's vocabulary. And strengths assessments, do something like strengths profiling. There's loads of tools online you can use to do that. To think, okay, what strengths do we each have in this team to help us navigate through this, that we can all lean on each other. Brené Brown, her strengths list where you go through and identify just one is really powerful in helping you drill it down. But it's a really, really good technique to help people know what they can do and what they're naturally good at and how they can all help each other through the tough times. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now and ask you all a question of what technique have you discovered today that's going to help your crew move forwards to calmer tides. I've gone back to you're the captain of the crew and on the ship and you're in stormy, changing, challenging waters. So what are you going to do to help move forwards towards the calmer tides and be the lighthouse? I'm going to ask you to be the captain and the lighthouse with my analogies, but what do you think? Might be something you're already doing that you've ascertained is a really good idea and you're going to keep doing it. But anything that you've thought about, we've covered, could be the traffic light system. It could be working on your specific competencies based on the wheel. Could be predictability anchors, could be validating different emotions, more regular one-to-ones and team meetings using those questions. Not that I'm giving you prompts, things to say, but just to recap on everything we've covered, what do you think you're going to use as a technique moving forwards? We're waiting for those to come through. So in case you missed it, question on the slide, what techniques have you discovered that you're going to use to help your crew move forwards to calmer tides through times of change and challenge? Whilst you're thinking of those, just to leave you with a parting slide of how we can help if you do need a bit of assistance for your managers, for your teams in how to navigate through these different times. Just an example of some of the titles we've got on this topic. So the ones in purple are all leadership topics. Ice and Fire is a full day that is actually accredited by the IRSM, but a range of different training solutions based on different types of change that leaders are navigating. The ones in the dark blue, sorry, are ones for employees. So ones around change agility, around resilience, how to cope with change, how to rewire the brain to have more cognitive flexibility, and all members of the IRSM eligible for a 25% discount on all of those sessions. So I'll leave a QR code on there if you want to book a meeting with the team to talk about anything. If you want to book a meeting with me to ask me any questions privately one-to-one on anything we've talked about. But in the meantime, you've put some points in the Q&A, which is good. Open meetings with how we'll each overcome problems, challenges, help the team reflect on we are there for each other, and it's a leader's view. That is why we are here. Love that. Absolutely emphasize that this is going to be difficult. We don't want to negate or reduce or be like, yeah, it's all fine. This is really difficult, and it's really important we are there for each other, and making sure people that they can reach out and talk to each other, but also to you as a leader. So I love that one. Firstly, say don't panic. Follow experiences related to each type of incident, focus and listen to each of the team. Yeah, listen to people, ask for them, how do you think we could navigate this change more effectively? How do you think I could support you? But don't panic. Absolutely. So thinking about the red of the traffic light, just stop. Okay, is this a disaster? Okay, how are we going to cope with this? Ask more questions. How are you feeling? Be more empathic. Be open, honest, transparent. Take the team on the journey. Don't just push them off and let them go. It's funny you say about journey there, Steve, because Ice and Fire is exactly that. So it's kind of a pun on Lord of the Rings type that journey, but it is a journey that we're going on. So people have to be feeling part of that, and it's going to have highs and lows because all journeys do. But it is absolutely that, something we're moving through. Allow time for emotions and time to process, consolidate, and actively promote moving forwards. Make the goals achievable and let the sea change happen. I also like the capacity question. Thanos, is honestly, it's probably one of the tips that gets applied for most of my trainings the most, of just saying, what's your number? Is it possible to have a recording of the training? Sue, that's a question for you, but I'm sure you probably, I know it's being recorded, so it's probably going to be sent somewhere. But I think that's all the ones we've got in the chat. So I'll leave it there that we've got a Q&R code. If you do want to have a meeting, you can book a meeting with the team, book a meeting directly with me. Any questions that you've got, you want to ask one-to-one, as I say, if you want to ask anything about the training that we offer in this space, then please just let us know. Any final questions before we close off the session? I've tried to answer them as we go through. Has anyone got anything they'd like to say or comment before we finish? Will they get a recording, Sue? I'm assuming they do.
Yeah, the recording goes on to the IRSM hub for people
Right.
to access. So yes, the hub, once it's been downloaded and edited a little bit, so I come off of it, it'll go on to the hub. Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you assist a colleague who's difficult to relate with to change? I think we need to create a space, or we need to find out why they're difficult to relate to the change. There could be so many other factors going on for that person at home or in their personal life that means that it's making it really difficult. So just creating that space. I'd take them somewhere that's an informal open space. So if you're virtual, then just making sure they know this is a time to talk about them and how they're feeling, and encourage them to open up to you. If it is something you're on site and you could go for a walk, or just create a really informal, relaxed space that you can say, I want to talk to you about the changes happening, and invite them to discuss it. Also, it might be a tactic to ask if they want to express that in a different way. That's okay. Some people don't feel comfortable opening up to this sort of one-to-one, so they might want to put it in writing, just because they might feel more able to express themselves in that way. So give them alternative ways to get support. And if they don't want to reach out to you, if you've got things like mental health first aiders, an EAP, another manager, HR, making sure they know that they can go to them instead, because sometimes people like different types of support rather than talking to a manager about it. So definitely a variety of communication and safe space is really, really important. So I think that's a wrap. So I think we're on time.
I think we are. Yeah. Thank you ever so